I'm going to introduce our speaker, Marc Cosentino, which we are absolutely thrilled to have join us for this webinar. He is the world-renowned case question expert and author of Case in Point. He has over 25 years of experience with case questions and case interviewing. He himself has written over 100 cases, trained over 100,000 students and alumni over the years. In addition to this, he holds workshops at top colleges and MBA programs this year at over 50, as well as train the trainer in terms of training the career services professionals that many of you have worked with in the past. And in addition to that, he is also very active in corporate training with Fortune 500 companies, focusing on teaching PhDs and other employees in terms of how to think from a business perspective. So taking those consulting skill sets and applying them across Fortune 500 companies. In terms of Case in Point, which is what many of you will know him best for, it's now in its 7th edition. It's the #1 selling interview book on Amazon, the #1 consulting book, the #1 case interview book on Amazon. On his website, casequestions.com, is where you can find it, whether to order a hard copy through Amazon or access it on a Kindle, an iBook, or a Nook. So clearly, when it comes to the world of case interviews and case questions, we definitely have the world expert on that. So we're thrilled to have you, Marc. And with that, I'm going to pass it over to you. And again, if you guys have any questions on technical difficulties or outside that, please do send them to the chat, and we'll answer them as we go.
Thanks, Christine, and welcome, everybody. I'm going to talk about case interviewing today. It's something I'd love to talk about, and I've been chatting about it for a long time. Case interviews are a little over 30 years old. They were first started by the management and strategic consulting firms, the big boys like McKinsey and BCG and Bain. But now they've spread. So if you have students who are interested in strategic planning, marketing, private equity, investment banking, finance, operations, human capital, and nonprofits, chances are they're going to get at least one, if not multiple case questions. I did a pro bono case for the Orange County Sheriff's Department bomb squad a couple years ago, and now the bomb squad uses case interviews to interview their bomb technicians. So they're popping up all over the place. It's a great skill to have. It's something that your students should be familiar with and should excel in. It's not only going to help them think when they get into the workplace, but it will also help them with their classwork as well. There are different types of cases. The first type is the market sizing case. The dreaded how many ping pong balls fit inside a 747 or how many disposable diapers were sold in the United States last year. All the student has to work with here is logic and assumptions. Even if they had read the number of disposable diapers that were sold last year in the United States, it wouldn't matter. The recruiter wants to see how they would come up with a number based solely on logic and assumptions. Also, the student doesn't get to ask questions unless they're clarifying questions. So if the interviewer used industry slang or industry jargon or a string of initials that the student doesn't understand, then they can ask a question. But other than that, during the market sizing questions, it's basically they have to walk the interviewer through their process. So in the case of how many disposable diapers were sold in the United States last year, the student would start with the population of the United States, which we just had a census, and it's about 310 million. But 310 isn't an easy number to work with, so I usually bump it up to 320 million. I also make the assumption that the average life expectancy of an American is 80 years. And I also make the assumption, and I know it will probably raise some eyebrows, but there are even numbers of people in each age group. So they're the exact same number of 2-year-olds as they are 72-year-olds. We know that that's not true, but for a case like this, it's a fair assumption. Also, the interviewer is much more interested in the student's thought process than whether they have their numbers right or the numbers exact. So even if I said there are 250 million Americans, the average life expectancy is 75, it wouldn't matter to the recruiter. So now, let's say I use 250. So I'm taking 250 million, I'm dividing it by 75, and I'm coming up with 3.3 million people per age group. Children wear diapers on average from age 0 to 3, so about 9.9, 10 million kids. They always want to round their numbers up to make the numbers as easy for themselves or for yourselves as possible. So out of those 10 million kids, I'm going to assume that maybe 80% of them wear disposable diapers. So that's 8 million kids hopefully changing their diapers 5 times a day. So that's 40 million diapers a day times 360 or 370, because you know you never get down to your last diaper more than once. Now, you may not agree with all my assumptions, but as long as you can follow my logic, I'm fine. And again, they're looking at the thought process. They're not looking at the numbers. Tell your students to think ahead and use numbers that are going to be easy for them to use. So that's an example of a market sizing question. The student would walk through it. Sometimes they walk through it once and then they go back and fill in the numbers. If you do that, you kind of have a second bite at the apple because you may think of additional things as you go through it for the second time. But again, they're looking to see how you think. Then you'll get verbal questions, and these are the most popular. They kind of fall into 2 types. One is, here's my problem, what do I do? It's very broad, vague. The student needs to spend a lot of time really kind of structuring their or laying out their structure. And we'll talk about that a little bit later. But one of the key things is that once the student lays out their structure, it's important that they know that they're not married to it, because things are going to change. The case is going to take twists and turns. There's going to be new variables. That structure might become obsolete pretty quickly, but it's there. The recruiter's just looking for, at this moment in time, with this limited amount of information, how would you answer this case? And so they would lay that out, and that would be their structure. Now, sometimes the case is, here's my problem. I want you to figure out these 4 things: market size, break even, price, and let's say profits. If you get one of those are basically your structure. They're telling you what they want you to figure out. But one of the key things here to remember is that you don't have to answer them in the order in which they were given. A lot of times people will jump immediately into doing the market size, which is probably the right thing to do about 80% of the time. But if you're talking about a new product and you don't know what the price is and there's not a lot of competition, then you're going to want to figure out what the price is before you figure out what the market sizing is or market size is. So keep in mind that when you have one of those structured cases, that you don't have to answer it in the order in which they were given. Also, some of these cases are pretty short. You know, how do we increase sales at our local bookstore? But others go on for, it seems like, 2 or 3 minutes, and there's a lot of information. So the student really needs to kind of take good notes and capture all that data. And again, we'll talk about that in a second as well. Also, chances are that you're going to get some case questions, verbal case questions, which have a market sizing component in it. So DuPont has developed a new material. It's biodegradable, super absorbent, strong, perfect for disposable diapers. How big is the disposable diaper market? Should DuPont enter that market, and if so, how? So that's a combination case of having both the market sizing and entering a new market. When I first started doing this 25 years ago, the two big case questions were, how many piano tuners are there in San Francisco? And Toyota brought out a new model, how would you market it? Today's cases are a lot more sophisticated, and students need to put a lot more time and effort into it. Other types of cases are written cases. You walk into the interview, they'll hand you 2 or 3 pages of written text, say, take a half an hour, read this, and then be prepared to present it. And, oh, by the way, I want 3 PowerPoint slides to go along with what you tell me. And I want one of those slides to be a chart. Now, in case interviews, you don't get to use a calculator. You don't get to use a computer, so you don't have PowerPoint or Chart Wizard. Also, there's a lot of math in these questions, and as I mentioned, you can't use a calculator. So, when was the last time you multiplied 2 numbers together and your answer had 8 or 9 zeros at the end of it? When was the last time you did long division by hand? But one of the main reasons that they make the students do math without a calculator isn't to see whether they can multiply and divide. It's to see if they think before they speak. So if they multiplied 2 numbers together and they came up with 180 million, and the answer should have been 1.8 billion, and 180 million doesn't make any sense at all, then that's going to raise some eyebrows. And even if the student catches his mistake right away and says, no, I'm sorry, it's got to be 1.8 billion, you can't unring the bell. Now, they can probably get away with one of those during an interview, and it's not going to be a problem. But if that happens twice, twice is a pattern, and if it's a pattern, it's a problem. So they need to feel comfortable with the student. If they make that kind of mistake in something that's as important as an interview, what are they going to do in front of a client? Or what are they going to do in front of my boss? I can't trust them anymore. If I can't trust them, I'm not going to hire them. So that's one type of oral or verbal case. The other type is a student will be sitting in a conference room, a recruiter will walk in and drop a document on the desk that's about 100 pages long. And they'll say, take half an hour, read this, and be prepared to discuss it. So if that ever happens to you, what you want to do, besides climb out the window, is to read the executive summary up front and then spend the rest of the time with the exhibits in the back. You're going to learn much more by going through the exhibits than you ever would by starting on page 1 and reading as far as you can in 30 minutes. There are also group interviews that are taking place. Some firms do it as their first interview, and other firms do it at the end of the process. Basically, they're looking for the same thing. They're looking to see whether you or the student, plays well with others. So if you're ever in a group interview, what you want to do is you want to be respectful of the other people in the group. On one hand, these guys are your competitors. They're after the exact same job you're after. But on the other hand, for this one moment in time, they're your teammates, and you need to treat them as teammates with respect and also be inclusive. You can't elbow anybody out of the way. You can't try to talk over them. You need to work as part of a team, much like students do when they are working on problem sets in school. Also, there are a number of group cases. Monitor does this where students walk in and they're handed a written case, 2 or 3 pages. They walk into a room and there's three other people in there who they've never met before, and they have to work as part of a team in order to make a presentation in front of 3 consultants. So the recruiter usually sits in the corner of the room and watches how this all unfolds. Who becomes the leader? How did they become the leader? Who does the quant stuff? Oftentimes in a case like this, they'll have a computer and they'll be able to do the PowerPoint because they're going to make a presentation in front of 3 people. So they're looking to see how the work is divided, how people work amongst each other. Now, they may bring one person back or they may bring all 4 people back. You're not ranked as a team, you're ranked individually. Also, sometimes they will give you a take-home case. This is very rare, but some non-consulting firms will do this. They'll give you information, you can take it home, and then you come in and you make a presentation. And sometimes they'll do what I call a slide case. We had a partner doing an interview, and he said to the student, I just gave a slide presentation to my client. This was the problem. This was the solution. I have a deck of slides here. Tell me what's on my slides and in which order they are. So the student would say, well, I would bring this up, and the partner would flip through and say, okay, that was slide number 3. Why did you put it first? And they would work through the whole deck like that. So case interviews are really kind of taking new forms, but the foundation and the principles are the same. It's just the delivery is a little different. There's also a lot of charts in these cases. Sometimes they'll give you the chart right up front. Sometimes they'll slide it over to you in the middle of the case and say, this important information just came in. And the student has a very short period of time to look at it, analyze it, extract what's important, and then apply it to their answer. And these slides, they're not well designed. They're designed to make the student really dig for information. So the student really needs to be able to figure this out. All right. Now, going on to the next slide. Now, the case, the interview process is the student, goes in and they'll ask the student some behavioral questions up front, particularly, why my firm, why consulting, and of course the student needs to look them right in the eye, and that answer has to be right out of the box, because if they look away, then that indicates to them that the student is thinking about their answer, and with a question like that, they should have thought about that answer weeks before they entered the interview. They'll also ask questions about persuasion, teamwork, management, leadership, those kinds of things. And the students should have some stories to tell. And when they're writing out the answers to those typical behavioral questions, they should, one, write them out in bullet points, because people try to memorize passages. And unless you're Al Pacino, there's no way you're going to memorize this, feed it back to the interviewer, and have them believe it. The other thing they like to do is say, okay, give me an example of a time you persuaded a group to do something they didn't want to do. You give your answer, and they say, great, give me another one. Great, give me another one. So tell your students to go 3 stories deep when they're writing out their behavioral questions. Also, because the case takes up so much time, students don't get an opportunity to talk about things that they would normally talk about. So if they're going through the interview and the recruiter didn't ask them about something that they feel the recruiter needs to know, at the end, when the recruiter says, do you have any questions for me, the student can simply say, before I ask my first question, I just want to make sure that you understand this, or I get a chance to talk about my experience here, because I think it's directly relevant to what I'll be doing for you. And they don't want to walk out that door without having brought that up. They should also be walking into the interview with a list of questions written out in advance that they want to ask. The palest ink is stronger than the best memory, so if they blank out, it's all right there. But it also shows the interviewer that they're not winging this, that they're giving this a lot of thought. And then they'll go and they'll have usually a smaller case, and then they'll meet the second person, and the case will be much longer, oftentimes with a market sizing component tied into the larger case. So the interviewer gives the student the case. The first thing they want to do is they want to summarize the case. And you want to do this for a couple reasons. One, you as an interviewee get to hear it again. Two, a lot of times the interviewer will talk fairly quickly. The case is long, and you didn't get a chance to write everything down, or you didn't get all the information. By summarizing the case, if you got some numbers wrong, if you didn't get all the information, they'll fill it in as you repeat it. It also fills the gap of silence between the end of the interviewer's question and the beginning of the student's answer. Because if the question is asked and the student looks up at the ceiling or down at their feet or out the window for 10 or 20 or 30 seconds, it seems like a lifetime, and the awkward clock starts ticking. So the student needs some momentum, because otherwise they're dead in the water. They have nowhere to go. So by summarizing, it gives them a little bit of momentum. Then the next step is to verify the objective. Okay. Oftentimes, the objective drives the whole case. And oftentimes, there's a secondary objective that they don't tell you about that could pop up halfway through the case and bite you. So you always want to get in the habit of verifying the objective, but also asking, are there any other objectives I should be concerned with? If there are, they'll tell you. If there's not, you don't have to worry about it. Also, when you're summarizing the case, if the case has numbers in it and the numbers are related, so an example would be Harley-Davidson stock dropped from $54 a share to $49 a share on news of declining profits. What's going on, and how can we turn this around? So when the student summarizes that, if they tell me that the stock dropped from 54 to 49, that's fine, but they're not gaining any extra points. If they tell me the stock dropped by $5, well, that's new information. But you know what? It's not very helpful information. I don't know what $5 means. But if they tell me that the stock dropped by about 10%, I know what 10% means, what it represents. And you can bet if you ever sit down with a consultant, that's one of the things they always do, is they try to quantify things, particularly by percentages. So if any numbers are related, stock pricing, year-to-year comparisons, the student wants to quantify those numbers. All right, so we summarize the case, we verify the objective. The third step they want to do is ask some questions. This is their opportunity to gather some data about the case. So they can ask questions about the product, the market, the company, whatever the case is about. They can ask between 3 and 5 questions. And then the fourth step, which is by far the toughest, is laying out their structure. If they can identify and label the case in their mind based on a case scenario, and one of the things in the book is the Ivy case system. And that's my, I hate to call it a framework, but that's my structure guide. It's been very well received. BCG a couple years ago bought 1,000 copies of the book to hand out to MBA students because they like the Ivy case system. It's broken down into 12 different scenarios. I don't want the student to worry about the number 12 because there's a lot of redundancy in those 12 scenarios. But what it does do is it points you in the right direction. There's nothing in there that they don't already know because it's based on common sense and it's based on business sense. So one example would be, one scenario would be entering a new market. So if you want to enter a new market, what do you want to know? You want to know who are the major players, what market share do they have, how do their products or services differ from what we're going to offer, and are there any barriers to entry? Access to capital, access to distribution channels, access to raw material, government relations, those sorts of things. They also want to know or think about, well, there's basically 3 ways to enter a market. You can start your own company and grow organically. You can buy your way into the market, or you can do a joint venture with another firm. And you would look at the advantages and disadvantages of each one of those. So that's one example. There was nothing in there that you didn't already know. It's based on common sense. The IVK system was originally developed for Harvard undergrads who have no business background at all. I spent 18 years in career services at Harvard. 9 of those were with undergrads, and that's when I developed that system. So they summarized the case, verified the objective, asked some questions, and then they laid out their structure. And then once they lay out their structure, then they can move forward through the case. Now, as I mentioned earlier, there's a lot of numbers in these cases, and you need to tell the students that they need to practice their math. No one expects them to do every calculation in their head. Sometimes it's easier to do it in your head than do it on paper, particularly when there's lots of zeros. But that's the biggest math problem I see, is people are off by a 0 and they don't realize it. So whenever they do a calculation, they should ask themselves, does this number make sense? If it makes sense, then say it. If it doesn't make sense, then go back and recalculate it, because you know they're going to make you recalculate it anyway. So, and I don't care if it's an applied math major or a PhD in string theory, everybody has problems with zeros, so people need to practice. Okay. Now, preparation strategies. Okay. Nothing beats live practice. And students at top schools, both at the MBA level and at the undergraduate level, will do 30 practice cases before they stick their big toe into an interview. They'll also probably read 40 cases as well, because that builds up an archive in the back of their mind, and they can often say, you know what, that's just like the Coca-Cola case, I'm going to do these things. Now, they're looking at a big time commitment. Besides reading case in point, doing those practice cases and doing the reading cases as well, they're looking at, easily a 60 to 90 hour commitment in order to compete for some of those McKinsey, BCG, top consulting jobs. The other things they can do is I recommend to everybody that they do a case journal. So for every case that they do live, for every case that they read, write down what was the problem, what was the solution, what did the solution turn out to be, but more importantly, what didn't I think about? Okay. Because then if you write that down, things that you don't normally think about naturally become second nature to you, because you're going to have all this information in one journal. You're going to be adding to it. You're going to be flipping back through it on a regular basis. And having written it down and reviewing it constantly, you'll have a really good document that's full of business problems and solutions and things that you have thought of and remembered. So journal is huge. Also, I'm going to give a quick plug for CQI, Case Questions Interactive. It has a lot of math, it has a lot of market sizing, it has a lot of case starts, it has a lot of material that will help them prep at night alone or working. But the reason I bring it up is that on game day, the day of the interview, students should get on CQI, or they should get on McKinsey.com or BCG and work through at least one of the cases on one of those sites, or work through some of the math problems or the market sizing problems on CQI. No Major League Baseball player you ever admired stepped up to the plate without taking batting practice. And it's difficult to go into an interview, sit down, and do a case. What you want to do is you want to warm up before you go in there. And what the students will discover, if they haven't already, that if they sit and do 3 practice cases in a row, chances are they're doing better on the second case and third case, even if the first case was easier, because now they're in the right mindset, they have their head wrapped around this thing, and they're ready to go. If you just walk in cold, it's tough to get started again. So on game day, use one of those online sites in order to warm up. But again, nothing beats live practice. Okay. All right, let's see what else we got here. All right, well, I touched on part of this, the general framework, and I'm a big believer in the IVK system. The Gallup Consulting Group just bought that chapter, and they're using it in training their consultants in-house, and it's easy to use and something that your students should spend a lot of time with. Let's see, as far as steps. A couple of things that I want to mention is that silence. This is one of the questions I always get. Silence is okay as long as you're doing something. So if you're doing a calculation, if you're writing down a chart, or you're writing down your notes, then silence is fine. But if you're looking out the window or down at your shoes, interviewers have very little patience for that. They like to be entertained. And as long as you're writing, they're entertaining, because when they're not looking you in the eye, they're looking at what you're writing down, because they know what you should be writing down, and they're trying to follow your thought process, which is one of the reasons why you want to try to draw your notes if you can. And by draw your notes, I mean arrows, decision trees, boxes, charts, that sort of thing. It makes it much easier for them to follow your notes. But the other, and 2 other important reasons is, if you've ever sat down with a consultant, they often draw their notes, so you want to match them. But more importantly, if you draw a decision tree or a chart, you can then turn your page towards them, flip it around towards them, and walk them through your thought process. Because the interviewer is sitting back, throwing out information, acting like an interviewer. If you turn your page towards them and start walking them through your thought process, they're now leaning over the table, going through this with you. And when they break this imaginary plane at the end of the table, they go from being an interviewer to being a client. And you want them to act like a client as much as possible, or to think as a client as much as possible. In fact, on the evaluation sheet, one of the things they evaluate you on is teamwork. And so you think, it's a one-on-one interview. How can they evaluate me on teamwork? Well, the reason is, did you bring them into the process? Did you make them feel part of it? Did you make them feel like a client? Because a case interview is really a role play, right? You're the consultant, I'm the client, here's my problem, what do I do? And you have a very short period of time to listen to my problem, think about a solution, structure it, answer it, and then articulate that, all while I'm sitting 2 feet away from you watching everything that you write down. So it's a very intimidating process, but it's also fun. Case interviews can be a lot of fun. I had a number of my Harvard students come in even after they got the job and ask me to give them a case. They love doing cases. To them, it was no different than doing a crossword puzzle or doing Sudoku. They loved the intellectual challenge, and they learned something new every time they did one. So you want to get people excited about that. And once they get past the first 4 or 5 cases and they see how it unfolds, then they're going to be very excited about it.
Excellent, Mark. That was fantastic. We do have some questions from the audience. Do you want to get those now?
Fire away.
Excellent. Okay. So one person was asking about, how many rounds can they expect interviewing with consulting firms, and do the case expectations change from round to round?
Usually, to get all the way through, it's either 2 or 3 rounds. It depends on the firm itself. The first round cases are a little easier than the second round cases. Also, however, the first round cases, you're usually going to be given those cases by MBAs who are kind of associates who have been out of school for maybe 3 years or so. And they tend to be a little tougher only because for the interviewer to take you to the next step, they have to make sure that you're qualified, because they're sticking their neck out for you by recommending you to the next step. Where when you go and you meet senior management, they're more interested in whether or not you're a good fit, and that they can bring you in front of a client. So during the first round, it's usually 2 45-minute back-to-back interviews. You're going to get a small case in the first interview, and then you're going to get a full case in the second of those interviews. The second round could be anywhere from meeting 1 or 2 people for an hour each to meeting 5 people and doing 5 different cases. And those cases are going to be harder than the cases you got in the first round. And if there is a third round, it's usually when you're meeting with a partner. And partner cases are all over the place, because sometimes the partner will pull out a case that he's been using for the last 10 years, and it's become a classic, and he doesn't know it. So that kind of case is pretty easy. But sometimes they'll throw out just an idea. They'll say, what do you think about the fact that Apple should buy Netflix before Facebook goes public and buys them? So it's just a general discussion, but they're looking to see how the student thinks and how they articulate, and whether or not they can hold a good, solid discussion when they're talking to a partner. And the partner, and actually all throughout the whole process, people are going to challenge the interviewer by saying things like, let me tell you why you're wrong, and they're going to get into the student's face to see how they react, whether or not they can defend their answer without getting defensive.
Right. Interesting. Okay. We have another question here on, what are some of the differences? You did mention that case interviewing is used, yes, in consulting, but in lots of other fields. What are the more common fields that you'll face case interviews, and what are some of the differences, let's say, that they might be looking for versus in the classic consulting world?
Okay, that's a good question, because if you go into strategic planning, your case is going to be similar to a consulting case. However, if you go into a marketing case, it's going to be different, because most students will use the 4 Ps in marketing, and they'll kind of walk through that. But that's really kind of a checklist. So you want to go and tie in bits and pieces of the Ivy case system when you're answering those marketing cases. Also, when you go into finance, if it's investment banking, chances are instead of charts, you're going to get spreadsheets, and you're going to need to analyze spreadsheets. If it's a merger and acquisition department, if it's a private equity company, you may have to do valuations. You may have to do industry analysis. Are some of the things that you're gonna find. Operation cases are more kind of value chain type of work. But if you can do the consulting cases, you'll be able to do any of those, because the consulting ones are the toughest.
Okay. Excellent. And in particular, let's say you had my first interview when I interviewed for consulting firms was over the phone. So how do you recommend people prepare, let's say, for phone interviews when it's not in person? Are there any things that you recommend doing differently, or different strategies they can use when you don't have that face-to-face contact?
Just a couple things. One, the most important thing is your voice. And that's all they have to go on. So you need to be enthusiastic. You need to have a lot of confidence in your voice. And you need to have a lot of confidence in your voice anyway during a case interview. There's an old saying about Harvard professors, and I'm sure it's true at just about any school. They're often wrong, but they're never uncertain. And you need to take that same type of attitude into the case with you, because you need to have your confidence level high. And you're going to get knocked around. Everybody gets knocked around a little bit. If you get knocked around, you need to get your confidence level right back up there, even if you had gotten knocked around. So your voice in a phone interview is so important. Also, you want to make sure that your calculator is in the refrigerator or somewhere away, because if they hear you punching numbers on a calculator, the next thing you're going to hear is a dial tone.
Right.
And those are probably the main things. The last thing is that when you're working through your math over the phone, kind of talk them through it more than you would if it's in a one-on-one. And don't worry about the silence. There's going to be the silence is going to seem even worse when you're over the phone than when you're working across from somebody. But if they've given cases over the phone before, so they know that there are going to be big gaps of silence, and they're probably surfing the net anyway while they're giving you the interview. So they're going to be entertained. But you can probably get 30 to 45 seconds, maybe even as long as a minute, depending on what you're doing, of silence before they'll ask you, okay, what are you thinking? What are you up to?
Right. Excellent. Okay, we just had another question come in on market sizing. Is this something, are market sizing questions something you can expect at the entry level, so let's say leaving undergraduate, or is that only at the MBA level?
Everything that I talked about today, you can expect at the undergraduate level. They ask pretty much the same cases. It's just that their expectation of the answer is much different than it would be for an MBA or for an MA or an advanced degree in another discipline. So I kind of, MBAs are off by themselves, and their answers, the expected answers, are going to be a lot more detailed and a lot deeper than an undergrad or a PhD student or a master's in another discipline. The questions are the same. They don't expect you to have the business knowledge. They're interested in how you think. So yes, everything's going to be pretty much the same.
Okay, excellent. And a question on the key criteria that you're being judged on for a case interview. You mentioned structure. What are some of the other ones that they're really looking for?
Okay, well, structure, quant, whether you quantify your numbers and how you do in your math plays a big role. Body language, eye contact, kind of overall communication skills. One thing I didn't talk about that I just want to take a second to talk about are case notes. Most of the firms will take your notes at the end of the interview. They'll scoop them up, put them in your file, and it's one more data point that they look at. So they look very closely at your notes. Most firms like it when you hold your paper landscape. And on the left-hand side is where you would write down the question. Write down everything you can and then draw a line. Because they're looking to see on your notes what you wrote down, how you wrote it, how you did your math, how well organized the notes are, and can they read your handwriting. Now, in that left-hand column, when you're writing everything down for the first time, if your handwriting's a little messy, that's fine, as long as you can read it. But for the rest of the notes need to be clean. So I put my objective across the top on kind of that right-hand column, and then I write down the answers to the questions that I asked them and they gave me, and then I will lay out my structure there. Also, I tend to like using graph paper. A lot of firms like it when you use graph paper, the ones with the big squares and the light background, because it reminds me to graph things if I can, and they love it when you graph it. But it also helps keep my zeros lined up. Again, because math, the zeros is the biggest math problem. You may want to do your math on a separate sheet of paper. That way your other notes stay clean and linear. And you may also want to circle anything that's important that you think is going to make the summary. Now, on all cases, whether or not you make it all the way through the case or not, and if you don't get all the way through, it's not the end of the world. There's a lot of reasons why you wouldn't have gotten through the whole case. Maybe we talked about your resume for too long and we got a late start. Maybe you brought up something I didn't think about, and now that I'm thinking about it, I asked you to drill down on it. So, there are reasons why you wouldn't finish the case, but whether you finish it or not, chances are they're going to ask you to summarize the case. Now, when you summarize, you don't get 10 or 20 seconds to collect your thoughts. You need to summarize almost immediately. So if you have 4 or 5 pages of notes, I've seen people kind of flipping back and forth through their notes, trying to remember what was important and where they wrote it down. But if you are taking notes and you know something's going to make the summary, you can circle it or highlight it in some way so it jumps off the page. The other thing about a summary is that it's short. It's maybe a minute and a half long at the most. It's not a rehash of every single thing we talked about. It's a little bit of the backstory and then 2 or 3 key recommendations that you want me to remember.
And Mark, you've mentioned a bunch of great things about things that people should do. Do you have a list of things that you absolutely shouldn't do, or your big faux pas?
Oh, well,
or common mistakes. Don't cry. That's a good one.
Don't cry. Don't get intimidated. Keep a positive attitude. Don't be afraid to ask for help. You can usually ask for help once, and it's not going to hurt you. But if you have to ask for help more than once, then you're sailing in troubled waters. But don't be afraid to ask for help. Don't use a cookie-cutter framework, because if they find that you're using the 5 C's or the 4 P's or Porter's 5 Forces or the 7 S's, they view that, all those frameworks, as kind of cookie-cutter frameworks, or really checklists. I see a lot of people who will use the profits equal revenues minus cost formula as a framework, and they use it for every single case. And to me, that's just as bad as using the 5 C's, because you're not showing me any intellectual curiosity. You know, you're not being you're not brainstorming or being insightful. And you know, brainstorming. Don't be afraid to brainstorm is another one. It's been my experience when interviewing students that they're reluctant to brainstorm because if they say something ridiculous, it gets hung around their neck and they're not going to get the job, where in reality, if they don't brainstorm, if they don't show that they can work as part of a team and generate ideas, they're not going to get the job.
Right. We just had a question come in on team interviews. So if you're not happy with either the answer that the team's come up with or how the team is approaching and structuring the case, you know, how would you approach that? You know, which is more important, working with the team or the actual result that you get to?
Working with the team. If it's the type of team case where you walk in, they hand you 2 or 3 pieces of paper, and then you go in and you meet 3 other people, and you guys have an hour to put together a presentation, you can certainly discuss how you want to do it and where your objections are, but in the end, you know, it's got to be a team decision. One other kind of group interview that I forgot to mention was sometimes at the end, when at the end of the recruiting process, they'll bring 5 people in, and when there's 3 available slots, and they'll give them a group case, and they'll see how well people within that group work together. And if they can't come up with any other criteria for elimination, it's the people who work together the best that they're going to bring back.
Interesting. That's very helpful. In terms of some of the math, I know we're jumping around a little bit here, but there's a lot of great questions coming in. You know, you said absolutely don't use a calculator, even if you're on a phone and it's somewhat silent. What are your thoughts on mental math versus writing math on paper? So should you be comfortable doing it, you know, the simple stuff in their head and then write the rest on paper, or do you have a perspective on that?
Well, I tell students that, you know, there's a rumor going around that you need to do all this math in your head and you need to do it in a nanosecond. Okay, that's not true. You actually get 3 nanoseconds to do it. I don't care how you do your math as long as you get it right. There are some people who can do the calculations in their head quickly, and that's great, but most of us can't. Most of us need to write it down. But also step back and see if it makes sense, if it's easier to do it in your head. Years ago, I was doing a mock interview with a student, and I threw out a math question. I said, 3 is what percentage of 17? 3 is what percentage of 17? And he blurted out 80%. Now, he must have been a legacy, because I don't know how else he got into college. But for him, that interview was over. There was nothing he could do to save himself. He might as well have gotten up and walked out right then and there, not because he gave me the wrong answer, but because it was so clear that he didn't think before he opened his mouth. And that's the critical thing about math is, you know, does your number make sense? And think it through. Blurting is never good in case interviews. Never. Even if they give you the case and you know what the answer is right away, you know, write it in the corner of your paper and kind of draw a box around it. That's almost as good as blurting. But, you know, blurting's not getting you anywhere because it doesn't show me how you think. In a way, it's no different than when you were in 8th grade taking a math class and you looked at the calculation and you came up with the answer, and the teacher said, you know, I don't care about the answer, show me your work. I want to see how you got there. This is the exact same thing. They want to know how you think, how you approach problems.
Right. Excellent. So we are we're running short on time. I'm just going to ask one more question in terms of, or two more questions. One, I think you already touched on a little bit. For summer internship interviews, are you expecting anything different again, or is it, you should be prepared and spending that same time investment?
Yeah, it's the exact same time investment. And the one thing that I do want to add to that is that I've been trying to get first years to keep practicing over the summer. They practice hard in November, December. They interview in January. They get their job, and then they drop case interviews like a hot potato. And quite frankly, I don't blame them. But if they don't pick it up again until September, when they come back to school, or late August, their second year of business school, you get hit with just a tidal wave of things. You got new classes, you got information meetings, you have networking meetings, and for you to kind of cut out, 60 hours to get back up to where you were, it's next to impossible. So, maintaining your case interviews over the summer, maintaining that journal where you have everything in one place. And as you read through the Wall Street Journal, as you read through the McKinsey Quarterly, anything that you see that's interesting, have them add to the journal. So at least they're treading water. But they should also try to hook up with some of their classmates to practice their cases over the summer, or maybe even other people from work to do it. But it's hard to come back stone cold and then try to get geared up again in a short period of time. And these are life-changing jobs. I get in trouble sometimes because whenever I do my workshop, I started off with, your job search is more important than your classes. And if there's any faculty in the room, they'll boo me. The career services people are usually nodding their head in agreement, as are the students. Because when you graduate, you're not going to care whether you got an A or a B in a course. You're going to care where you get up and go to work every day. And so students need to make a big investment and do it right, because they're not going to get a second bite at the apple.
Right. Excellent. I think that's fantastic advice. And anything else you'd like to add before we start to wrap up?
Not that I can think of. I was just trying to
Excellent.
talk as fast as I can. Those of you who know me know that I usually don't talk that fast. But I had a lot to say in a short period of time.
Excellent. Well, we really appreciate it. In terms of resources, so everyone on the can you move the slide ahead once, Mark?
Yep.
Wait.
Sure.
One more. There we go. So in terms of resources, clearly, Mark's book, Case in Point, is available online. On the Evisors blog and Facebook, so blog.evisors.com and facebook.com/evisors, we're going to be posting some of the resources that Mark has mentioned and some of the tips that he's brought out, so as well as the recording of this session. So I'd recommend everybody online to check that out. You can also follow us at evisors.com. We'll be tweeting a number of the case interview tips that you've been mentioning. And finally, in terms of live case prep, clearly there is Evisors itself. We do have dozens of Evisors from the top consulting firms who do live, when you're in your, either early or all the way to your final stages of case prep. Those are there to actually do the practice and get feedback from people who have kind of been there, done that. But with that, Mark, thank you so much for joining us. We really appreciate it. And, I appreciate you covering all that material in such a short amount of time. It is a lot to digest, but I think everyone here, or I speak for everyone here when I say that it was extremely helpful. So thanks again.
You're more than welcome.
All right. So with that, we will be signing off, and again, keep your eyes posted for the recording on facebook.com/evisors.
Okay.
Thank you.
All right. Thanks.
Okay.
Bye-bye.
Bye.